Every success has a story, but not every story ends in success. Few times in history do we find men who come from the backside of life emerging to becoming victorious in their days. I want to give you the story of 10 presidents who were once prisoners, people who were once behind bars, relegated to the hostile nature of the prisons. Some were revolutionaries, some were fighting for independence, some stood against certain colonial powers, while others simply tried to bring a new political reformation, which put them in deep trouble. But unlike many other revolutionary stories, these people stood out victorious, and in the midst of controversy, in the midst of these difficulties, in the midst of this pain, they emerged victorious and became presidents of the same nation and in the same nation where they were behind bars. This is a documentary of 10 people who left the prison and became presidents of the nation. Number 10 will amaze you. The first on our list is a man called Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela is most likely to be a household name.
Our major weapon of struggle against apartheid oppression and exploitation is our people organized into mass formation of the democratic movement.
One of the most famous leaders in the African continent, whose fame goes beyond the fabrics of Africa. His fame is so pronounced and loud that it affects the whole world at large. Nelson Mandela was in prison after leading the African National Congress armed wing against the apartheid system. Nelson Mandela was arrested in 1962 following the Rivonia trial. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1964, and he spent 27 years in prison. His time in incarceration included 18 years on Robben Island, which turned him into a global symbol of the anti-apartheid movement. The unique thing about Nelson Mandela is he refused to give up. He refused to let what he went through in the prison affect him. This was during the time of colonialism. You know, the African continent was massively plagued with slavery and slave trade, which ended by 1884 with the Berlin Conference, which was in November 1884 and spanned right to February 1885. And this is where 14 nations came together and began to decide what would happen to the African continent. And they gravitated from slavery and slave trade into colonization, where they'll be able to take charge over a territory and call it their own, where the resources, the people, and the manpower, and everything in that nation literally can be controlled by these foreign nations, while the African nations will be called the colonies. Nelson Mandela, being born in July 18, 1918, in a place called the Mvezo Umtata district of South Africa, died in December 5th, 2013, Johannesburg, and he died as a hero. He is popularly known as South Africa's black nationalist leader. Mandela studied law at the University of Witwatersrand, and in 1944 joined the African National Conference, the ANC, after the Sharpeville massacre in 1960. He abandoned his non-violent stance and helped found the Umkhonto weSizwe, which means spear of the nation, the ANC's military wing, and he was arrested in 1962. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Of course, Mandela retained a wide support among his fellow black South Africans and became a national cause celebrity. He was released by the press of F.W. de Klerk in 1990. Mandela replaced Oliver Tambo as president of the ANC in 1991, and in 1993 Mandela and de Klerk were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to end apartheid and bring about the transition to non-racial democracy. In 1994, Mandela was elected president of the country's first election open to all citizens. By the time he stepped down in 1999, unlike most other African leaders, Mandela wasn't power hungry. Rather, all he wanted to see was a better South Africa. And this is why every day behind bars was worth it, because it wasn't about being in prison, it wasn't about what he would experience, it was about the freedom of his people from the clouds of colonialism and the apartheid movement, which literally affected those of the black skin. And it was a racial move that affected the racial equality of the African people versus the white man. Mandela was a pivotal anti-apartheid revolutionary who spent 27 years in prison before becoming South Africa's first democratically elected president, leading the nation to reconciliation and democracy after the end of the apartheid, born in 1918. This is Nelson Mandela, a man who came from the prison and became president. The second on the list is very interesting. He's a man called Jomo Kenyatta from Kenya. He was a prominent anti-colonial activist and president of the nationalist Kenya African Union. Kenyatta was arrested in 1952 and sentenced in 1953 to 7 years of hard labor for his alleged involvement in the Mau Mau rebellion. He was held in various prisons and kept in detention camps and was successfully released in 1961. In 1963, 2 years down the line, after Kenya gained independence, Kenyatta became its first prime minister. He then transitioned to becoming the first president in 1964, a position he held until his death in 1978. The third on the list is a man called Ahmed Ben Bella of Algeria. As a national leader of the National Liberation Front during the Algerian War for Independence, Ben Bella was arrested and imprisoned by the French military from 1956 to 1962. After his release, he was elected the first president of Algeria. In 1963, he served until he was overthrown in a military coup in 1965 and was then placed under house arrest for 14 years. The next on the list, number 4, is Václav Havel. Václav Havel from Czech Republic, of what we call Czechoslovakia. Havel was repeatedly imprisoned by the communist regime in Czech Republic for his human rights activism. He co-authored the Charter 77 Manifesto in 1977, and he spent nearly 8 years in prison throughout the 1970s and 1980s. In 1988, Havel was a key figure in the Helvet Revolution that overthrew the communist government, and then he was elected president of Czechoslovakia in December 1989. After the country's dissolution, he was elected the first president of the Czech Republic in 1993. The fifth on the list is José Pepe Mujica of Uruguay. He was a former guerrilla fighter with the Tupamaros. Mujica was arrested multiple times and was tortured and imprisoned for over 14 years during the Uruguay military dictatorship in the 1970s to 1980s. He was released in 1985 under the amnesty law. Mujica later entered the mainstream politics and was elected as the 40th president of Uruguay, and he served from 2010 to 2015. Number 6 on the list is Kim Dae-jung of South Korea. Kim was arrested numerous times and even sentenced to death for sedition. Before the sentence was commuted, in one instance, he was also kidnapped by the Korean Central Intelligence Agency. To cut the long story short, after years of struggle for democracy, he was elected president in 1997, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize in the year 2000 for his sunshine policy in North Korea. The seventh on the list is Michelle Bachelet from Chile. Following a military coup in Chile in 1973, Bachelet, a medical student and the daughter of an Air Force general, was arrested and tortured in a secret prison. She was eventually exiled. After returning to Chile and becoming a leading politician, she was elected president twice, serving from 2006 to 2010 and also from 2014 to 2018. Next on the list is Lech Walesa of Poland. He was a co-founder of the Solidarity Trade Union. Walesa was interned and imprisoned several times in the 1980s by communist government for his anti-regime activities. His activism was key to the end of communism rule in Poland, and he was elected president in 1990 and served one term. The ninth on the list is Dilma Rousseff of Brazil. As a young Marxist in the 1970s, Rousseff was imprisoned and tortured for her resistance to the military dictatorship in Brazil. And many years down the line, and after so many years of torture and so many years of fight and in and out contention, she rose through the political ranks and was elected president of Brazil in 2010. She was impeached and removed from office just 6 years later in 2016. Here is the number 10 president who was once a prisoner. I would say that he is the first ever prisoner who turned president, and he's found in the Bible. His name is Joseph. Joseph was born in the family of a man called Jacob. Joseph actually is the 11th born of Jacob. Jacob has two wives. One is called Leah and the other is called Rachel. Jacob actually loves Rachel but doesn't love Leah, and so he works under his father-in-law called Laban for 7 years just to get Rachel. But on the day of his wedding, something very strange happened. Laban, his father-in-law, tricked him and gave him Leah, the firstborn, instead of Rachel. And so in that despair, Jacob decides to labor for 7 more years, as the scripture declares that it felt like just a few days because he was in love with Rachel. So Leah and Rachel, when they were officially in the house of Jacob, they began to do a power struggle for relevance and who become the best wife. Leah, knowing that she wasn't loved by Jacob, but she was a wife by condition, decided to begin to have so many children. But Rachel, on the other hand, who was so beautiful, was unable to have children. And so after many years of prayer and consistently seeking the face of God, God finally grants a child to Rachel, the one that Jacob loved. And the first child is called Joseph, and the second is called Benjamin. But looking at it in the broader scale, Joseph is the firstborn to the union of Jacob and Rachel, but he is the 11th born in the family as a whole, because there were 10 children before Joseph was born. So Joseph was born, and this is the first seed of the woman that Jacob loved, and so he began to treat Joseph with so much care. In fact, the name Joseph means he will add. This wasn't just a name, it was a prophetic scroll releasing the prophetic destiny of the man called Joseph. And so many years down the line, Joseph becomes a young adult, and he has brothers, 11 of them, and they are jealous of him because of how much favoritism their father Jacob shows Joseph, because he's the son of the woman that Jacob loves. Many years down the line, Joseph's mother Rachel dies, and so the only thing that Jacob has to hold on to remember his wife is Joseph and Benjamin. Here's where the story even gets more crazy, because the love that Joseph received from Jacob, his father, sparked a lot of anger from his other brothers. In Genesis 30, the name Joseph is given. Genesis 30, verse 24, which means he will add. These were the names of his brothers. We had Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. These were the names of Joseph's brothers. So one day, Jacob sends Joseph to check after his brothers, and this was after Joseph began having dreams of himself being the head and his brothers bowing down to him. Genesis 37 verse 7, he said, "For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves stood round about it and made obeisance to my sheaf." And that meant that he would lead his brothers. But this wasn't just an ambitious young man, he was driven by vision. Little did he know that the story was about to get sour. One day, Jacob sends Joseph to check after his brothers, and they conspire, of course without the consent of Benjamin, and they decide to kill Joseph. And Reuben, the eldest brother, says, "I oppose. Let's rather do something else with him than to stain our hands with his blood." So they organize a sabotage, and they take Joseph and put in a pit. Later on, take him off the pit, and they sold him to the Ishmaelites for a very insignificant amount of money. This wasn't about money, because Jacob was a very wealthy man, and so his sons were not financially down. Quickly, Joseph is taken as a servant, and the Ishmaelites sell him to a man in Egypt called Potiphar. And when Joseph gets there, the dominion mandate upon Joseph becomes so great and so wild that Potiphar can't just resist but to see the impact of Joseph in his house, how that the resources there kept on increasing, and everything in the hands of Joseph kept on doing better and better. Joseph's brothers strip him off the coat that Jacob made for him, a coat of many colors, and then kill an animal and take the animal's blood and rub on the coat, and then lie to Jacob that they found the coat of Joseph and they believe an animal has eaten him, and this made Jacob to mourn. That was how they covered the evil they had done to their own brother. But they didn't know that they were just paving a way for prophecy to manifest in the life of Joseph. Many years down the line, Joseph gets scandalized, and the wife of his boss, Potiphar's wife, begins to make sexual advances at him. And she liked him, and every day she would insist that he should compromise his standard and have intercourse. with her. But Joseph, being a man of principles, stood his ground and was prepared to go to prison and possibly executed just to stay on the principles of God. He knew, I had a dream, and this is not the location of my dream. Don't stop moving until you arrive where God told you will be. Potiphar's wife sets him up, calls him to her room, and then tries to force herself on him, and Joseph resists her, but she was able to get a hold of his clothes. And then when her husband returns, she puts up a whole drama and lies that Joseph tried to rape her. And that's how he was thrown into prison. From a man who was hated by family, hated by brothers, he finds himself in the prison cell. While some historians believe that Joseph spent approximately 10 to 13 years in prison, the Bible states in Genesis 41 that after 2 full years, Pharaoh had a dream. When Joseph went to prison, he was made the head of all prisoners because there was something upon him that made him the leader in every facility or field of life he was found in. Whether as a slave, whether as a son, and whether as a prisoner, he was always made the head. So when he became a prisoner, sometime later, the king was angry at his cupbearer and his baker and sent them to prison where they had dreams, and Joseph was able to help to interpret their dreams meticulously. When the Bible says in Genesis 41 that 2 years after, it was 2 years after the cupbearer was released from prison, not necessarily 2 years after Joseph was put in prison, because Joseph was in prison before the cupbearer actually got into prison. So he may have been there for years. He may have been there for 5 years, 7 years, 8 years, possibly 11 years. So historians say, and it's an arguable knowledge, that he spent approximately 10 to 13 years in the prison. Joseph is in prison and the king has a dream. He had a dream where they came out of the river 7 well-favored cows, and they were fat-fleshed and well-fed, and from the same river came 7 thin cows, and the thin cows swallowed the fat cows. And so the king was in confusion and began to consult which magician can solve it. And then the servant who was helped by Joseph in the prison remembers that 2 years ago someone helped me to interpret my dream. And so Joseph is called and he interprets the dream of the king, and the king says, who else can be put in charge of these things except you, who God has given wisdom to? Here was the interpretation. The 7 fat cows means 7 years of plenty, economic booming, agricultural expansion. But the 17 cows actually suggest the opposite. It was years of scarcity, drought, and total loss of crops, agriculture, and money. And so the king seeks the wisdom of Joseph, and here is how the prisoner became a president. The king put Joseph over everything, including his household. The only person that Joseph was not above was Pharaoh himself. This is a success story of the prisoner who became a king. His name is Joseph. If you think that this story is even crazy, then check out my video on the man that changed the world. The man that built a facility that accommodated every species of animals and plants we have surviving today. Please like, share, and subscribe. King speaking.